This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and mātauranga Māori. Brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr Barb, and today in the studio we are super lucky. We have here Emeritus Professor Lachy Paterson. So Emeritus Professor Te Tumu, University of Otago, and you have quite an illustrious career here, Lachy. BA in Māori Studies and History from the University of Otago, followed by a postgraduate diploma and then a PhD in Māori Studies looking at history of Māori Language Newspapers in New Zealand. And you did various other jobs and things and then returned to the University of Otago as I don't suppose you returned straight away as a professor, but you worked your way up from lecturer to professor. Hey, welcome and thank you very much for coming along today.
Kia ora, Barbara. Yes, I did all my university study at University of Otago, and I worked at the Polytech a little bit and a Māori training institute called Ako no Te Rangatahi for a while. And
what sort of training institute is that? What were they training for?
Well, I was actually teaching a Māori language course at that institute, a night class.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, it might be the same one that I did.
No, you weren't there when I was there.
No. No, I had the amazing Marcia Cassidy as my.
Oh, wow.
As my.
Yeah. So it was a wānanga or Aotearoa course, but it was actually being run out of a separate institution. They were running it for the wānanga. So it predated the Te Wānanga Aotearoa coming to Dunedin.
Oh, fantastic. And originally from Whakatane, is it?
Yes.
That's right. So, yes, tell us about your route from Whakatane all the way to here to Dunedin. That's
okay. Well,
it's a stride and a half, isn't it?
Yes. Well, yeah, well, if you want the long story.
I should say, feel free to introduce yourself to family and whānau before we get started on the in-depth.
I grew up in Whakatane, and when I had about 18, I was a bit footloose. I like to sort of think of it as my misspent youth.
Right.
And I had friends that had come to Dunedin for university, and I was just bumming around. And I thought, well, why not go down there and just see what they're up to? So I came down and I had various jobs. I worked on the railways. I worked out at Cherry Farm for a little while.
Oh, right.
And, just...
As an orderly or nurse?
A nurse aide.
Yeah.
And then eventually I ended up, because I was living out at Palmerston, just north of Dunedin.
Yeah.
And then I came back I got into a relationship, came back to Dunedin and still worked for the railways. When my marriage broke up, that's when I went to university and as a solo dad.
Right.
And sort of...
It's a bit unusual really as well, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it was. But in those days I had a good training incentive allowance and they paid your fees. So it was actually... and I was on the domestic purposes benefit as well.
Right.
So I did a BA and then I carried on in Māori Studies.
And what drew you to Māori Studies? Because you don't actually whakapapa Māori.
No, I don't. Well, I come from Whakatane, which is sort of the area, I guess, is about 40% Māori. It's sort of one of the higher percentages of Māori that live there. So, but I wouldn't say that I actually knew an awful lot about Māori culture or language at the time. It's sort of hard to know really exactly, but I just sort of felt that it was something that would be good to do.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So,
I suppose that background in the back of your mind, you sort of had this kind of, there's this culture that's been around, I've been around all my life, but I don't know sufficient for myself. So, yeah. And I guess that's an interesting thing about university, isn't it? It is a place to discover and learn things that you just might not otherwise. And I think that's the beauty of arts degrees, because that's I personally, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I personally think that we shouldn't have arts degrees and science degrees as separated as they are. So every science degree you should have to have a component of arts subjects in it, and vice versa, so that every arts degree, every arts graduate comes out with a little bit of science, and every science graduate comes out with a little bit of humanities. I think we do ourselves a huge disservice by kind of polarising those two fields like that.
Yes.
If you'd like to comment on that in any way, but
well, that's actually going back to what it was like 120 odd years ago in universities, where a person doing a BA had to do maths.
Yeah.
And there were some people that struggled with the maths at university level and failed. Yeah. And I'm just thinking of a Māori intellectual by the name of Reweti Kohere, who was an editor of a Māori Language Newspaper, and he was unable to get his BA essentially because he couldn't do the maths.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, goodness.
Yes. Where were we?
Oh, I can't remember. We were talking about about your illustrious how you got into doing Māori studies here at Otago University.
Yeah, when I worked for the railways, I was away working away from home quite a lot, and you had three options of what you did in the evening when you were staying in a motel or a hotel or something like that. And that one was to go to the pub.
Yeah.
One was to just watch TV, and the other one was to read or educate yourself. Yeah. So I started teaching myself Māori there.
Right.
And then I went to a night class at Logan Park. And finally I did bursary Māori through correspondence school.
Right.
So when I came to university,
you already had some of the language at least.
I did, and I sort of knew that I'd already made that decision that this is what I was wanting to do.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because in some ways it might have been much easier to have learned it as a kid in whakatane.
Oh, of course.
with all the resources and the populace around there, but I guess that was just a different time, a different culture.
It was, and to be honest, Māori and Pākehā mixed at school a bit. They mixed at work and sometimes in sports. But the two communities back then were, I wouldn't say separate, but they definitely didn't mix greatly.
Yeah.
You could do Māori at high school, and a lot of people don't realise this, but at that time, and I'm talking in the 1970s when I was at high school, the School C Māori, well, School C was...
that was fifth form, so that was year 11 now.
Yeah, so that was scaled, so that, say like if you were doing English, half of people would pass, half of people would fail.
Right.
If you were doing Latin, you were clever, so 80% of the people would pass and 20% would fail.
Unbelievable.
But if you were a Māori person doing Māori, you may not have been doing particularly well in other things, so they said, Māori people don't pass things. So less than 50% of people that were doing school certificate Māori were allowed to pass.
Oh, God, how strange.
So,
scaling gone wrong in a big way.
That's right.
Yeah. Wow.
It was just racist.
That's just crazy, isn't it? Really crazy.
Yeah, because for some Māori kids, it might have been the one thing that
they actually could do. Imagine
really
that,
well.
Imagine that growing up as a Māori kid, going to school, everything's in English, speaking Māori at home, you're actually really good at it, and then somehow the system makes you fail in a subject that you feel like you've been doing quite well in. Oh, God, it's kind of atrocious, really, eh? It's not surprising that there's some personal trauma from that background
Yes.
in various people. So we are here today. We're going to talk about Māori newspapers,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So we're stepping back a
Yes.
whole nother kind of large step. So what time are we thinking about here? When were like Māori newspapers? I imagine that there's a lot of people out there who actually may not even realise that there are or have been, or the importance of Māori newspapers to Aotearoa New Zealand, and especially historically, I guess, and currently also for the information that they give to researchers like yourself now, looking at that kind of critical time, which is now pretty much beyond living memory, isn't it? It's
well beyond living memory. What people, I guess, have to remember is that in 1840, when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, New Zealand already had a quarter of a century of missionaries.
Yeah.
And the missionaries had introduced literacy and reading and writing. And while it's very difficult to know exactly how many people were literate, quite a few people were, and they were certainly able to read things out to other people. Now, most of the material that they had was the Bible and other religious texts. There wasn't a huge amount of what we might call literature in Te Reo Māori. So the government, the other thing, so that's one thing to remember. The second thing to remember is that Māori, Te Reo Māori, is made up of dialects, but essentially a person from one area, even though their dialect might be different, their mita, they can understand someone else's dialect. So for the government, it was Te Reo Māori through the 19th century was very much what they call a civic language. So this is a term that Mamadi Stevens from Victoria has come up with.
A civic language.
Civic language. So, you had English, you had stuff going out to the Pākehā settlers in English, and then you also had stuff from the government going out in Te Reo Māori to Māori people.
I think the big thing that a lot of people, when you just think about it but don't think about it properly, like just sort of superficially think about it, is we forget that the relative numbers of people in New Zealand and the relative number of Māori compared to European people in New Zealand. I don't know if you've got those numbers to hand, but I imagine that the proportion of people in New Zealand that were Māori or were Māori and Māori speakers, because a lot of those Europeans, in order to trade, would have had to learn Te Reo Māori. So I imagine that the proportion of people who understood Te Reo as opposed to English was quite a lot higher.
Yes, well, what you have to remember as well is there's a huge influx of Pākehā settlers through the 19th century. In 1840, there may have been maybe 2,000 Pākehā in the country. By the time you get to the mid-1850s, it's about the same.
Balanced out.
Yeah, so within 15 years, the number of Pākehā sort of roughly matches the number of Māori. The difference of, I think to remember there, of course, is that in the South Island, where there weren't so many Māori, that there would have been way more Pākehā earlier than Māori were earlier. In the North Island, it was probably quite a bit later that the numbers balanced out.
So there's that geographical kind of mismatch across the country. And I guess also with the South Island, there was that early history of whalers and sealers that had come earlier and lots of single males as opposed to families and kind of
that's right,
pretty much kind of intermarried into the...
So the two areas where there was a lot of Pākehā settlement before 1840 was down here around Otago and up in Bay of Islands. But if we get back to newspapers, so one language, so it was easy for the government to put out a newspaper, which it started to do in 1842.
Wow.
So less than 2 years. So it was from the 1st of January 1842, less than 2 years since the signing of the treaty, there is a Māori language newspaper.
That's interesting. And what kind of things were in the newspaper? Was it just like a newspaper that was kind of government information, or was it more like we think of newspapers now with sort of stories and letters to the editor and adverts and all the other things that are in?
Well, if we're talking about the government newspapers, it was very much about promoting what it called ngā tikanga pai, the good customs.
Okay.
Good customs.
I feel like we can discuss this some more.
So that was sort of like why it's good to sell some land, because then you'd have some Pākehā that would come and live near you, and you'd have someone to trade with, and you'd have people that could show you the new world and civilization and that kind of thing. Ngā tikanga pai sort of covered everything that you might think about in terms of modernity and Western civilization. So wearing European clothes, using knives and forks, sitting at a table when you eat, right out to why the government's law was the best,
right.
And why everyone should adhere to it. Education was another one. It was a very, very, very big issue. It really pushed that your children should be learning English. It was telling Māori this in Māori.
In Māori, yeah.
So
that's an interesting kind of, and that was kind of, was there a government newspaper that went across the whole of New Zealand?
Yes.
And was it just one, or were there many?
Well, in terms of the government newspapers, occasionally there was two, right. But most of the time there was just one. So the one that started in 1840, it chopped and changed a little bit over in its lifetime, but it stopped in 1863. Right.
So that's sort of 23 years, quarter of a century.
Yes. And I guess it's sort of no Māori language newspapers, ones run by Māori or by churches or by the government, made money.
Right.
There was just no way that enough Māori would buy the newspaper so that it would pay for itself.
Right. So were they sold?
Some were sold
for a nominal.
Some were sold. Some of the government ones, these initial ones, were given away.
Right.
They would send them to chiefs. And we're not talking about a huge number. We're talking about like maybe 500 issues.
Right.
But the thing to remember is that the nature of Māori society at that time was that people sat and discussed political issues. They sat and discussed everything. So a paper would come to a chief. It might not be him that reads it out, but someone would read it out to everybody.
Yeah.
And so that one paper might be going out to,
20 or 30 families, easy or
more.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you would have hui from chiefs from different places coming together, and they would be discussing what was in the paper. So,
and I imagine there was quite a lot of critical thinking around what it was there, as opposed to just taking what was written as for want of a better word, gospel.
Well, the thing that I guess you've got to remember is that in 1840, this whole colonisation thing was like, hey, what is this? We don't know what it is. Maybe there's some real benefits. We can see that, trade, opportunities, that kind of thing will be able to, become more modern. All of these sorts of things influenced some Māori that they were like, yep, we can get into this.
Yeah.
But, of course, it didn't take them too long to realise that, Pākehā aren't actually that interested in us. They're interested in our land.
Yeah.
And our well-being is attached to the land, whether it's financial well-being, being able to generate our own wealth, or, an emotional well-being. And Pākehā don't really care about us at all. And at that time as well, you're having certain discourse going around that Māori were going to die out.
Yeah, there was quite a kind of commentary around that. And was that how, that was, I guess, with the introduced European diseases. Is that the kind of main driver there? Or
yeah, I think it is, yes.
Yeah. And I guess that's because they didn't have a natural immunity to the diseases because they just hadn't encountered them.
Yes,
historically.
There's sort of, but also, like if you've got Pākehā coming, they've got STDs, VD, and then that means that makes some women sterile. Therefore, you're not going to get as many children.
Yeah.
There's that kind of thing happening as well. There's a whole, and then during the wars, of course, there's a lot of disruption and death in the New Zealand wars. And then, if you marginalise people,
you're disrupting their food sources as well.
But if you marginalise people economically, then generally, that impacts on their health as well. So there's a whole lot of reasons why colonialism is a trigger, I guess, for poor health in Māori society in the 19th century.
And that's newspapers. So there was the government ones, which were very much kind of telling a government story. Government, this is why you want, basically why we want to do this. But there were also church ones. So what were they very much aligned with the government ones, or less so?
Their main purpose is, to for people to become better Christians.
Yeah. I've never, to be honest, I was probably showing my own biases here, but I've never understood it. I have no problem with other people being religious, but I don't know why they have to convince everybody else to be the same religion. That, to me, is the...
Well, that's part of the evangelical drive of Christianity.
Yeah, it's
one of the reasons for Christianity, I guess, is that you're meant to go out there and be a witness for God, that you've offered somebody the opportunity to become a Christian.
And I guess different sects of Christianity take that to different levels.
That's right. Now, when we're talking about church newspapers, we had one sort of around about 1860, which was it aligned itself pretty much with the government when it was talking about politics.
Yeah,
and that was run by a Wesleyan, a Methodist minister. But when we're talking about church papers that came later on, say like if we're looking at Te Pipi Wharaurua, which came around the turn of the previous century, so around about 1900, that was actually run by Māori men who were part of the Anglican Church. So their focus was quite different, and they could be quite critical of some aspects of colonialism.
Right. So when you say their focus was quite different, what was it focused on?
Well, again, it's the context of the time.
Yeah.
So there was this idea that was getting stronger around that time that Māori were going to die out. Right. So there was a movement called the Young Māori Party, which was headed by people like Sir Apirana Ngata, who were trying to reform Māori society. So being a better Christian meant that you probably were going to change your behaviours in certain ways, so you would be, a better, or your health would be better. You might be a little bit more industrious and all of those things. So they've been criticised sometimes because they were supposedly wanting Māori to assimilate to into becoming Pākehā. But that wasn't really the case. What they wanted was for Māori to survive.
Right.
And how they saw that at the time was, you've got to do all of these things to reform the way that you live.
Which is interesting because the way that they were living was largely driven by the introduction of Pākehā into New Zealand.
Yes. Oh yes, Māori society.
Because previous to European introduction, they were doing well.
Yeah. And some of the things that they came up with, it was sort of, I guess, their understandings at the time. So, like Māori should live in houses with separate rooms because that was healthier than everyone living in one space. Māori perhaps shouldn't hongi because that would be a way of passing germs on to each other. So that was sort of some of the things that they were saying. But then it was also, hey, we should be holding on to our own land so that we can be productive and have farms and progress. They could be quite critical of the way that Pākehā, sort of considered Māori. Also, when it came to tikanga, they were very keen to promote, things like kapahaka, building of meeting houses. There's a whole lot so it's a complicated time.
Right.
So this particular Māori newspaper, Te Pipi Wharaurua, was headed by a chap called Reweti Kohere. And he was a good friend of Ngata's. He was a member of the Young Māori Party as well as being a minister within the Anglican Church.
Right.
So,
And this is Māori writing for Māori, right?
Exactly.
Yes. So,
all of these papers are for a Māori audience, even if they're written by Pākehā or written by Māori.
Yeah.
So Reweti Kohere was actually quite radical in a lot of respects.
And did they still have advertisements and classifieds and things in them as well?
Some do, some don't.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was just wondering how much, like, as a historian looking at them, how much information you can get from the context of the kind of stories that are written there, the articles, and how much you get from the sort of other stuff around it, the classifieds, and just as a window into...
Oh, yes. It's amazing the kinds of things that... And of course, it changes over time as well, the what's in the newspapers.
Yeah.
But so some of the Māori newspapers that were put out by Māori political sort of groupings from the 1870s onwards, their focus was land, hold on to the land.
Right.
Let's resist the Māori Land Court if we can.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so there was actually, I've got it written down as something that I should say about.
Yeah.
There were two distinct periods of whawhai newspaper or newspaper wars.
Newspaper wars. Oh, interesting. So this is when like two newspapers go out
head to
head. Right.
Right. So most people know that in 1863 the government invaded the Waikato to fight the Kingitanga, the Māori King movement, and try and destroy it.
I'm not sure that most people do know that, but
okay,
it is a thing.
Yeah. So just prior to that, in 1862, the Māori King movement got their own printing press.
Right.
It's a long story, but the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire donated it to them.
Wow.
Yep. So a couple of chiefs went over.
To Austria?
Yep. They were taken over by a visiting Austrian warship, and they spent some time in Vienna. And they were celebrities, of course, and they were asked, what would you like to have? And they said, can we have a printing press?
Wow.
So
I mean, that's quite cool, isn't it? Like, you've like, this is in, the heyday of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire type, and then they're saying, there's all these jewels and I don't know, pianos and instruments and everything everywhere around, and they say, what would you like? And they say, actually, we'd like a printing press.
Yes. So the printing press was a British one. They sent it to New Zealand, and it got sent to Ngāruawāhia, which was the capital of the Māori King movement. Mm. And they published this paper called Te Hokioi. its full name is Te Hokioi o Nuitere ni e rere ana. So the Hokioi, mythical bird, which is flying, the mythical bird of New Zealand.
It's quite a cool name, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. So it was putting out it's probably the most radical of all the newspapers.
Right.
And it was putting out an anti-colonial stance against the government's propaganda.
Right.
So it sort of had its own propaganda. It was a counter-propaganda organ to the government's propaganda. So it was saying things like, well, actually, maybe the treaty's a fraud. Lots of people didn't sign it. We didn't sign it.
Right.
Maybe, we never actually, if you look at the treaty says that,
because this is, what's this? This is
1863.
1863, so this is 20 years-ish post.
Yep. And they're saying, you know what, the Treaty of Waitangi says that Māori have rangatiratanga of their land unless it gets sold to the Crown. It says we've never sold Waikato River. That's our river, and we're saying that government shouldn't be able to send warships up, like gunboats up the river. So they were quite anti-government, quite radical. And so the government set up its own, had an official that was in Te Awamutu. He sets up his own newspaper there, basically, and they have this, just for a short period, this sort of war.
Clash of words.
Exactly. And sometimes there'll be an incident, and I'm thinking of one in particular, where the government had tried to establish a building which was going to be an army barracks on Kingitanga land.
Right.
And the Kingitanga went and grabbed all the timber and floated it down the river and onto the land that the government held and said, there, put
your building on your own land.
Exactly. And so it was interesting, like to read about that incident from the government propaganda side and also from the Kingitanga propaganda side, to see how they sort of portrayed this to their readers. But unfortunately,
both in Te Reo, right?
Yep, both in Te Reo,
which is quite an interesting thing as well, because they're not trying to convince the European settlers of this at all.
No.
They're trying to convince like a sector of Māori society that this is the way. And I guess that's where it's really useful to remember that Māori isn't one unified group of kind of homogenous people.
No, that's right. Unfortunately, of course, the government invaded the Kingitanga and the press got hidden and then got lost, ended up in a swamp. And it wasn't sort of dug out until, I think, then.
But they did find it again.
Yes, but it's in the Te Awamutu Museum. If anyone wants to go and have a look at it, essentially what's there is the frame.
Right, so all the little letters, basically, all
gone.
All gone. Did they have macrons on their letters? No. I was just thinking because they didn't get specially cast ones that had macrons. Were there macrons back then?
Not so much in newspapers. There were some Pākehā who published things in Māori, and they would very occasionally use a macron. But generally speaking, it wasn't. If everyone can speak Māori fluently, they can read something quickly, they can get the context of it.
And you know if it's supposed to have a macron on it, or how it's pronounced anyway.
Exactly.
I mean, like when we read, we know that wind and wind are said differently, but we just know that they are, but based on the context of where they're put.
Exactly. So
that's interesting, isn't it?
So macrons are really, or the macrons or the double vowels, is really sort of mid 20th century onwards.
Right, so it's sort of the 1950s.
Well, even later than that probably, but it's definitely not
it's interesting, isn't it? So it's sort of as the kind of general speaking of the language got less, I guess it was, less people would like fluent from birth, shall we say? I don't know.
Well, macrons are there because most people that are reading Māori are not fluent speakers.
Yeah, and like as a beginner, I find them incredibly helpful because it's like this is how you. It's just a grammatical indication of this is how you say this word.
So I'm handing Barbara
amazing. Is this an actual old newspaper?
Yes.
Wow. Am I allowed to touch it?
Yes.
Te Waka Māori.
Okay, so this was this was a government newspaper.
Wow.
That was put out in the 1870s, and it had the same sort of mission as earlier government newspapers, was trying to get Māori to sort of
1872.
Yeah. So it got into a whawhai newspaper, a newspaper war with a Māori-run newspaper called Te Wānanga.
Wow.
And that went on for a few years, and it was all around about land.
Right. I mean, that was the critical thing at the time, wasn't it?
Yes.
It's when everything was happening. I really like the format of the newspaper. It's much easier to read and like much smaller. It's slightly bigger than an A4 in a slightly odd format, I guess.
Yes.
It's not a standard A4 or I don't know, maybe it's one of those funny American.
A4 is really modern anyway.
Yeah, but it's not what you think of as a newspaper. Like the ODT is massive and unwieldy and you can't easily sit there and read it, whereas this is, 3 or 4 pages. How many pages is it? 6? Double-sided.
1, 2,
but yeah, obviously meant to be kind of easily portable.
So 8 pages.
8 pages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is one of the issues. What is a newspaper? Because for Māori, anything that was a periodical, so printed, and printed with the idea that there would be a series of them, was called a newspaper, whereas today we go, oh, that's a journal or that's a magazine or that is a newspaper. But everything back then was a newspaper.
Which kind of makes sense. Yes. Like it's got some sort of story in it, news.
And if you look at it, even though it's smaller than what we think of as a newspaper, it's still got a masthead.
Yeah. Which is very clearly pictorial as well as with the name of it.
Yeah, it's the only picture of it. And it's telling you it's a government newspaper because it's the government's coat of arms or the royal coat of arms at the time. And I
didn't pick that because it's I don't know that it's the same now. So it's got a unicorn.
Well, yeah, it's the British.
It's the British one.
It's the British one. Whereas, it's not the New Zealand one. So, it's got. You can see all sorts of different things in it. It starts off with who's subscribed, their names, and how much they've paid.
That's odd, isn't it?
They quite often did that.
They quite often did that. Yep. Who's the subscribers to it?
Well, Tamihana Te Rauparaha, so he's Ngāti Raukawa Ngāti Toa from Otaki. He's the son of the great chief Te Rauparaha, so he's paid £1, so he might be getting 2 issues. There's a few.
I guess it kind of is like sponsorship. It's like sort of saying these people have signed up to. That's right. To read this, so it's kind of like it's endorsed by these people, which is a bit strange, isn't it? If you just buy a newspaper just to see what they're saying, you're not necessarily endorsing what they're saying. You're just wanting to know what they're saying.
Yeah. So even though this is a government newspaper and it is a propaganda rag, there's no doubt about it. It's still, there's a lot of things that you can find out by reading it. Yeah. It sort of gives a few short answers to letters that came in. It talks about its motto. So, ko te tika, ko te pono, ko te aroha. So, tika is doing right, pono is being truthful or loyal, and aroha is love. So, and it has an editorial on that.
And do the articles have bylines, or are they all just kind of anonymously written by the newspaper?
Sometimes they will have a name of who wrote it, but not always.
I just wondered if there was kind of a culture of journalists as much as there was of newspapers. If it was important who wrote it, or if it was just basically an organisation from the...
Often it was the people within the organisation. So this would have been people from the native department that wrote bits for this.
Right.
But we can see here there's a letter from a chief, and these two are about a death of a particular, of another chief.
So it's sort of an obituary section there.
There's a lot on obituaries and things. Here we've got some news and some verbatim reports from a meeting. So another meeting where the Ngāti Raukawa meet the Wellington superintendent at Otaki. So there's all sorts of different things, and then we've got some letters to the editor.
Interesting. So quite a large proportion of letters to the editor there, and sort of correspondence backwards. This is what happened at this meeting,
yes.
and I imagine different newspapers, did they report the same meetings in different ways if they were important meetings? So you'd get a sort of flavour of the minutes. But it's not really the minutes, it's the minutes with a bit of commentary.
Yeah, often there's only one newspaper alive at any particular moment. So,
oh, right. How many newspapers are we sort of talking about in total over the kind of time?
To be honest, I'm not sure, because I thought I knew all of them, and then I went and found, I didn't find them, but I mean, they were there in the archives.
Yeah.
I never even knew this one existed.
But sort of tens, hundreds?
No, there might be, oh goodness, might be 30.
Right,
yeah,
somewhere in that vicinity.
30, might be a few more.
And over a time period, we're looking at sort of from the 1840s, 1860s.
Okay, so from if you go to Papers Past,
yeah,
they've got a whole lot.
So that's just a kind of site that's digitised all of these.
Digitised newspapers. So
yeah.
There's English language newspapers as well as Māori ones. So
yeah.
the Māori ones go from 1842 to 1932.
Right.
However, there are several newspapers there's a number of newspapers that aren't on Papers Past.
Right.
And so you've got a Mormon newspaper that carried on to 1960s.
Oh, right.
There's a Presbyterian one that went from the 30s through to the 1960s. The Ratana Church newspaper, which is only a tiny little...
A tiny little sort of A5 type pamphlet.
Yes.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, that would be the size of a Bible as well, that you carry to church in and out as well. So you sort of slip it in the cover, don't you?
Then you have things like Te Ao Hau, which is now considered to be like a magazine.
Right.
And it was probably more English than Māori language material in it. But particularly in its early days, it had a lot of Māori material in it. Well, that went on till 1975.
Oh, right.
And then if you look at sort of things like Mana Magazine, Tū Tangata, they were in English, but they would have bits of Māori in them.
Right.
And then from the late 80s, He Muka, which was a publication put out by Te Taurewhiri, the Māori Language Commission, totally into Reo Māori. So when did it finish? I don't know, but I don't think it ever finished.
Maybe it's just sort of undulated up and down.
That's right.
And I guess are there new, like there's I Tangata, which is mainly in English, I think, but clearly with a Māori audience in mind. And I guess that's the other stream that all alongside were their English language newspapers, but the target audience was clearly Māori.
Yes. And it was in Te Reo Māori because it was targeting Māori. As you come into the 20th century, you're getting Māori who don't speak Māori, don't read Māori. So some publications sort of just had more and more English in them.
And I guess there's a mixture of bilingual ones in the middle there as well.
Exactly.
As things.
And by the time you're getting to the 1940s and 50s, there's probably not many Māori who don't read English as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's certainly there's been peaks, there's been troughs, there's been gaps, but I think you can say that Te Reo Māori has been published in a periodical form in books, in newspapers, journals, and in magazines from 1842 to the present.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting how it changes over time, ups and sort of downs and different things. Because I imagine that, I don't actually know the numbers on this, maybe you know the numbers on this, but the proportion of people who have some te reo in New Zealand now is actually on the up. And as that continues, hopefully the proportion of people who are fluent will also track alongside it.
Yes, I don't really know how many people, I don't have the numbers. Probably more important than the number of just people overall that know some Māori is the number of people that are coming out of kura kaupapa who are fluent in te reo Māori as young people. And
a big shout out to the kura kaupapa Māori or Ōtepoti here, because they are fantastic.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic school, and it's a fantastic school to belong to as a student.
So that's one of the things that I noticed during my university career, was that when I was a student, there was, everyone was a second language learner.
Yeah.
Everyone. By the time that I left, which was a couple of years ago, left university, you've got a real cohort of Māori who are fluent, who have been speaking it at home and at school.
And in sort of informal social situations as well.
Yes.
So, in playtime, lunchtime, past the butter sort of things. So you get that kind of, just that less formal kind of slangness that comes with it, which allows a language to continue to evolve.
Yes. So there's definitely, I think, a market there for sort of reasonably high quality reo Māori, whether it's on the internet or whether it's printed, but definitely reading material.
Yeah, it's interesting
for that group of people, as well as people like you and I who might be learning te reo Māori.
Well, I think you and I are in slightly different classes there. Thank you for the inclusiveness there.
Well, if you don't grow up with it, then you're always a learner.
Yeah,
that's just the reality.
That's just the reality.
You can get quite good, but that's the way it is.
That's the way it is, and a lot of that is just where and when you were born as well. I mean,
yes.
I was born in a very white part of the country and brought up there, and we didn't have Māori studies at all at high school. So it was completely foreign.
Right.
Yeah. Very, very strange. Hey, I did say before the show that I would ask you for your favourite vegan recipe, because I know now that you're Emeritus professor, you spend a lot of time with the grandkids.
Some time with the grandkids, yes.
And very keen on your vegan recipes.
Yes, I have a YouTube channel by the name of Kiwi Vegan Grandad, and so I have some recipes there that I demonstrate. I guess one that I really like is making my own sausages.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what do you put in your sausages?
Gluten.
Ah, bread.
No, it's
just raw gluten.
Raw gluten, yeah.
Wow.
And so they're not a bready texture.
Right.
They've got a really.
Where does the gluten come from?
It comes from flour, but it's removed from the flour. So essentially, flour is made up of some protein and quite a bit of carbohydrate.
Yeah.
So they take out all the carbohydrate. You're left with the protein, and that is gluten.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then you just buy that as a dry powder?
Buy that as a dried powder. I go to the little Indian shop on St David's and...
the little supermarket there. Everybody goes there for that.
Yeah. And
I don't know if everybody goes there. That's where we go.
Yeah, that's where I get my beans and things, but I also get my gluten there as well.
Yeah, they have a great selection of different flours as well. So
yes.
This isn't an advert, by the way. They don't even know we're talking about them. But we always get out, buckwheat flour and all, and dried fruits and nuts and spices and things.
But you'll also see something there, and I think it's labelled something like glutinous wheat flour.
Right.
And that is gluten.
Oh, right, it's just gluten. Oh, interesting. Wow. Sometimes it takes a little bit of decoding what things actually are meaning by the label. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And, just to sign off on on the newspapers, what's the most amazing thing you've discovered from studying these? Because you've been studying them for quite some years now.
Yes.
And what keeps you studying them? What's the thing that draws you back to them?
It's just that you're always finding new things. It's a window on a different time. You hear a lot of Māori voices within the newspapers. So you hear voices from women who may not be in other government archives and things. So there's an awful lot of stuff that you get. The most amazing thing, I just wouldn't know. I did one a few years ago on a libel case.
Oh.
Yeah, and that was where it was this particular newspaper that you looked at, Te Waka Māori, which was it published a letter by a Māori woman about a Pākehā landholder or land, and it was that particular man who was a prominent politician decided that...
Oh, and he sued her?
No, he sued the other... He sued the newspaper.
Oh, right.
But she was called up as a witness, and it was just interesting because it told me an awful lot about... she'd written that letter, she couldn't read. She couldn't read and write.
Oh, right. So who wrote the letter?
Her husband.
Oh, right.
But she knew. She was the boss. She was a woman of high chiefliness.
Right.
So...
It's interesting, isn't it?
She was enmeshed in a textual culture.
Right.
Despite the fact that she couldn't read or write.
Right. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, and I guess that balance of the male and female voice has probably changed over time as well.
Yes. Well,
I personally am unconvinced that Māori society was as sexist as the Victorian missionaries that came into New Zealand in the mid to late 1800s.
Yeah, well, I worked with Angela Wanhala and we wrote a book called He Reo Wahine, Māori Women's Voices from the 19th Century. And, there's so much in there which shows that women had opinions, they were leaders, they were intellectuals, and they certainly were a presence.
It's interesting, eh? And, of course, why wouldn't they be? And, just look around the country today, some of our most prized politicians and leaders from Māoridom are women, and there's some amazing women out there. And just a quick note there, we've been talking mainly about newspapers that were in the North Island, but were there Otago newspapers?
I've heard stories that I think it was Taiaroa who had bought a printing press, but I've never come across any Māori language newspapers.
Yeah, because the ODT was around then already, wasn't it? What was that, sort of the late 1800s that it started?
1860s.
1860s, yeah. So the ODT would have been, and I guess there was a lot of newspapers back then, the Evening Star and the...
Yes, there were plenty of...
There was more than just the ODT. The number of newspapers has decreased in the Otago region. And of course, that's when Otago was booming with the gold rush, and there was just people everywhere. And I guess, as we were talking about before with the whalers and the sailors, that English sort of came into Otago earlier.
Yes.
But yeah, so I guess that there was a lot of... I think that the rates of literacy was really high amongst Māori. I'm not sure about amongst Europeans, but I imagine also sector of the European.
The only South Island newspaper Māori that I'm aware of was called He Kupu Whakamārama, and it was a religious newspaper that became the Te Pipi Wharaurua, but it started off in Nelson.
Right.
And then was shifted later on to Gisborne.
Right. Yeah, crazy, eh? It's amazing to me how much of an influence the various churches had on the newspapers and on Māori society as a whole. And maybe they had that on.
Well, you can't look at the 19th century and ignore religion.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with it or not.
I know.
It's just the way
it's that. Yeah, and I guess it was also, European society at the time was much more religious.
Exactly.
So it makes perfect sense that wherever they go, then they're also being very religious as well. So who knows? Well, hey, thank you very much, Lachy, and thank you for coming along today. If you would like to sign off, that is fabulous to have you along, and I will put the links to Papers Past and to your vegan channel.
Thank you.
Thank you. And also to your IPL, because that's fantastic as well.
O he mihi nui kia koe Barbara, mō tō tono kia hara mai ki te kōrero, mō taku kaupapa rata, ara ko ngā newspaper Māori. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora. You've been listening to the OI Podcast, the shout-out for the arts, sciences and mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI Podcast on ORFM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by ORFM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.